Shadows of Humanity Europe, 1942. The world had gone mad. Cities burned, trains screamed through the night, and millions disappeared into smoke. In those years, kindness itself became a crime, and silence was the only language most dared to speak. Neighbors turned their backs, friends closed their doors. The simple act of giving bread, of hiding a child, could cost you your life. And yet, some people did it anyway. They were not soldiers nor saints. They were teachers, diplomats, farmers, mothers, priests, imams, people who simply refused to let humanity die. They forged papers, built false walls, dug cellars, carried strangers through the snow. And when fear told them to stop, they whispered, "Not this time." In occupied Poland, a young woman carried babies out of the ghetto in burlap sacks. In Lithuania, a Japanese diplomat stamped thousands of visas until his hands bled. In Albania, Muslim families opened their doors to Jewish refugees, swearing on their honor, "Our guest is sacred." And across Europe, from Paris to Budapest, unknown hands pulled others from the darkness, one life at a time. Most never told their stories. They were buried without medals, without monuments, their courage known only to the ones they saved. But their actions, scattered like sparks across a burning continent, proved that even in humanity's darkest hour, light can still survive. This is their story. The story of the forgotten rescuers of the Holocaust, the people who, when the world surrendered to evil, chose to be good. Chapter 1. Europe in Darkness. When the war began in 1939, Europe descended into a nightmare that few could have imagined. One by one, nations fell under Nazi rule. Germany's armies marched not only with guns, but with ideology, an ideology that declared entire peoples unworthy of life. In the cities of Poland, Hungary, France, and the Netherlands, new laws appeared overnight. Jews were banned from schools, from businesses, from public spaces. They were stripped of their jobs, their property, and finally, their names. Yellow stars marked them in the streets. Trains began to run always east. At first, people whispered. Some pretended not to see. But soon, seeing itself became dangerous. To help a Jew, even to offer a glass of water or a night's shelter, was to risk death. Nazi posters warned that those who aid the enemies of the Reich will be executed. And they meant it. In Poland, entire families were shot for hiding their neighbors. In the Netherlands, resistance members were tortured to death. Fear became law. Most obeyed, but not all. In every corner of occupied Europe, there were those who refused to accept the new order, ordinary men and women who decided that conscience was worth more than survival. They had no power, no armies, no safe way out. All they had was a choice, to close their doors or to open them. Some did it for faith, others for friendship. Some could not even explain why. They just knew it was right. As the ghettos filled and the trains rolled toward Auschwitz, small acts of defiance began to bloom in the shadows. A loaf of bread slipped through a fence, a forged document passed beneath a table, a hidden room behind a bookshelf. Each act was a flicker of light, fragile, dangerous, but unstoppable. The darkness ruled Europe, yes, but light still moved quietly beneath it, carried by hands that refused to let go of hope. Chapter 2. The Kindness of Strangers. In times of horror, the most powerful weapon is mercy. And during the Holocaust, mercy often came from the unlikeliest hands, strangers who risked everything for people they barely knew. In occupied Poland, the walls of the Warsaw Ghetto sealed in nearly 500,000 people. Starvation, disease, and deportations tore families apart daily. But outside those walls, a quiet network began to form. Priests, teachers, social workers, and nuns, all bound by one mission: to save whoever they could. Among them was a young woman named Irina Sendler. She was a nurse, a face the guards barely noticed, carrying bundles in and out of the ghetto each day. Inside those bundles were infants, wrapped in rags, sleeping under toolboxes, or hidden beneath stretchers. Irina and her team saved over 2,500 children, giving each a new name, a new life, and a chance to grow up in a world that might still remember kindness. Elsewhere in Europe, similar stories unfolded. In France, convents turned into safe houses. In Holland, families like the Ten Booms built secret rooms behind their walls, a place for strangers to breathe freely for just a few more days. In Greece, entire villages erased Jewish names from local records, pretending they had never existed, to protect them from Nazi patrols. Most rescuers didn't see themselves as heroes. They weren't armed and they couldn't stop the trains, but they could save one person, one family, one moment. And in doing so, they declared, even quietly, that the Nazis would not define what it meant to be human. Many of them were betrayed. Some were caught, tortured, executed. Irina Sendler herself was arrested, beaten, and sentenced to death, but she never revealed a single name. Buried under pain, she still held on to hope that someday those children would grow up and tell the world what she and others had done. In every occupied country, there were faces like hers. Ordinary people who opened their doors when everyone else locked theirs. They didn't ask who you were or what you believed. They just saw a person, and that was enough. The Holocaust showed how cruel humanity could become, but the rescuers proved something greater, that even when the world falls apart, the kindness of strangers can still hold it together. Chapter 3. Diplomats who defied orders. War tends to turn compassion into weakness, but a few men in suits and passports turned it into power. They were diplomats, men of protocol, trained to obey, to sign papers, to follow orders. But in the face of genocide, some decided that obedience was no longer an option. In 1940, in the Lithuanian city of Kaunas, a line stretched for blocks outside the Japanese consulate. Families stood for days, clutching documents, photos, and hope. Inside, a single man worked tirelessly at his desk. Chune Sugihara, Japan's vice consul. Tokyo had given him a clear order: do not issue transit visas to Jews. But Sugihara looked out the window at the thousands waiting, and he broke that order. For weeks he handwrote visas by the thousands, as many as 6,000. His wife brought him tea as he worked through the night, his hand blistered from the pen. Even when he was forced to leave Lithuania, he signed visas on the train platform, tossing them through the window to desperate families as the train pulled away. He lost his career for it, but his conscience was clean. Far to the south, on the island of Rhodes, another diplomat was doing the same. Selahattin Ülkümen, Turkey's consul, stood up to the German authorities occupying the island. When they tried to deport the local Jewish population, Ülkümen confronted the SS commander himself. He declared that all Jews with Turkish connections, even distant relatives, were under his nation's protection. He saved dozens of families, forcing the Nazis to back down. Later, the Germans bombed his office and killed his wife in retaliation. Still, he never expressed regret. Then there was Raoul Wallenberg, a Swedish diplomat in Budapest. He printed thousands of fake protective passports, declared whole buildings Swedish territory, and personally pulled Jews off death trains. He saved over 100,000 lives before being captured by the Soviets, disappearing into a gulag, never to be seen again. These men did not share a flag a religion, or a culture, but they shared one belief: that rules without morality are not worth following. They turned paper, the same tool the Nazis used to condemn millions, into a weapon of salvation. And though many of them paid dearly, their signatures became something far greater than ink on a page. They became proof that even in a world ruled by fear, a single act of defiance could rewrite history. One visa, one name, one soul at a time. Chapter 4. Muslims who resisted the Nazis. While much of Europe fell silent under Nazi rule, in some corners of the Muslim world, in North Africa, the Balkans, and the Middle East, people of faith chose to stand against it. Their actions were rarely celebrated, sometimes forgotten, and often erased by politics. But behind those shadows were stories of remarkable courage, of faith turned into refuge. In Albania, a small mountainous nation under both Italian and German occupation, nearly every Muslim family that was asked to hide a Jew said yes. The Albanians called it Besa, a code of honor older than the war itself. Besa meant to keep your word and to protect your guest even at the cost of your own life. When Nazi patrols demanded lists of Jews, the Albanians refused. Entire villages erased records, forged papers, and claimed every refugee as a cousin or friend. By the end of the war, Albania was one of the only countries in Europe with more Jews than it had before 1939. In Morocco, King Mohammed V defied Hitler's puppet regime in Vichy, France. When Nazi officials demanded that Moroccan Jews wear yellow stars, the king refused, saying, "There are no Jews in my country." Only Moroccans under his protection, thousands were shielded from deportation. He invited Jewish families to royal banquets and made sure their names never appeared on Nazi lists. In Tunisia and Algeria, Muslim laborers and farmers risked their lives to hide Jewish neighbors in cellars and mosques. One imam in Paris, Si Kadur Bengabrit, secretly issued false certificates identifying hundreds of Jews as Muslims so they could escape the Gestapo. He turned the great mosque of Paris into a sanctuary, a holy place turned into a haven. And there were others, unknown and unrecorded, across Bosnia, Egypt, and Turkey, who passed food through fences, carried false papers, or simply refused to betray those hiding among them. They were not heroes in the traditional sense. They were believers who saw faith not as a wall, but as a bridge. For them, saving a life was an act of worship. The Nazis spoke of purity and blood. These rescuers answered with compassion and humanity. And though history rarely carved their names into marble, their deeds carved something deeper. Proof that even in an age of hatred, mercy can bloom where no one expects it. They were Muslims, but above all, they were human. And in a time when morality itself seemed extinct, they reminded the world what faith truly meant. Chapter 5. The Children. They saved. Every act of rescue began with a heartbeat, a cry in the dark, a knock on a stranger's door. But nowhere was the choice more heartbreaking or more courageous than in the rescue of children. Across Europe, thousands of Jewish children were hidden in convents, farms, orphanages, and attics. Many were carried away in silence, too young to understand why their parents were crying. They would grow up with new names, new languages, and new prayers, never knowing that the families raising them were risking their lives each day. In Warsaw, Irina Sendler's network smuggled children out of the ghetto in coffins, toolboxes, and potato sacks. Each child was given a new Christian identity and a number written on a secret list, buried under an apple tree, to be reclaimed when the war ended. She used fake birth certificates, sympathetic priests, and orphanages run by brave nuns who agreed to protect the little ones at any cost. In Belgium, Catholic monks and nuns hid hundreds of children in monasteries. Some took in babies and pretended they were orphans of Belgian soldiers. They risked arrest every day, yet when asked why, one nun said simply, "Because they were children." That was enough. In France, members of the Protestant village of Le Chambon-sur-Lignon opened their homes to fleeing families. School teachers taught Jewish and Christian children side by side, refusing to reveal who was who. Their motto was whispered among them: "We will resist evil with the weapons of love." And in the Netherlands, a young girl named Anne Frank wrote her diary while her father's friends kept her family hidden for 2 long years. Though her story ended in tragedy, it became a symbol for millions whose names we'll never know. Children who lived and those who didn't, bound by the same hope that someone, somewhere, might help them. After the war, the surviving children often struggled with identity. Many had forgotten their parents' faces or their own names. Some chose to stay with the families who saved them, while others began a painful search to rediscover who they were. But one thing never changed. They remembered the warmth of the hands that pulled them from the dark. They remembered the faces of those who whispered, "You are safe now." Those rescuers didn't just save lives. They preserved entire futures. Every child who survived carried within them a silent legacy, a living memory of defiance against death itself. And decades later, when they finally told their stories, one truth echoed through them all. The world may have abandoned them, but not everyone did. Someone, somewhere, chose to care. Chapter 6. Punishment and Silence. When the war ended in 1945, the world emerged from the ashes, but the rescuers did not step into glory. There were no medals waiting for them, no parades, no applause. For many, there was only silence. In Eastern Europe, where Soviet control replaced Nazi occupation, the new regimes viewed anyone who had helped Jews or worked with Western networks as potential traitors. People like Irina Sendler, who had risked her life to save thousands, were now interrogated by secret police, accused of collaboration with foreign agents. She lost her job, was silenced for decades, and her story nearly disappeared. In France and Belgium, the rescuers went back to their farms, schools, and convents. They rarely spoke of what they'd done. Some felt survivors' guilt, haunted by the faces they couldn't save. Others feared the same question that history always asks its heroes: why didn't you do more? In the Netherlands, members of the Ten Boom family who survived the camps returned to an empty home. Their courage had cost them everything. Corrie Ten Boom spent her life telling the story, not for fame, but to remind the world that even in suffering, forgiveness was possible. In Albania, where nearly every family had taken part in hiding Jews, decades of communist rule erased the story completely. To speak of faith, to mention religion, was forbidden. The Besa Code lived on, not in history books, but in whispers at the dinner table. Even the diplomats who had saved thousands were punished. Chune Sugihara was dismissed from Japan's foreign service and lived the rest of his life in poverty, selling light bulbs door to door. Raoul Wallenberg vanished into the Soviet Gulag, his fate unknown. Selahattin Ülkümen returned to Turkey a widower, his wife killed in retaliation for his defiance. The post-war years were filled with rebuilding, but also with forgetting. Governments wanted order, not memory. They wanted heroes who fit clean narratives, soldiers, generals, victors, not civilians who had disobeyed orders to save strangers. And yet, in quiet corners of Europe, small signs appeared. A letter tucked in a drawer, a faded photo of a child once hidden, a diary entry written in trembling ink. They waited, sometimes decades, for someone to notice, to ask, who were these people who risked everything when everyone else stayed silent? Because the greatest courage often leaves no witness, and the bravest acts are the ones history almost forgets. Chapter 7. Yad Vashem, the Garden of the Righteous. In 1953, on a quiet hill overlooking Jerusalem, a nation still mourning its dead decided to honor those who had refused to look away. The new state of Israel created Yad Vashem, the world's foremost Holocaust memorial, not only to remember the victims, but also to recognize the rare souls who had stood against the tide. They were given a name drawn from the book of Isaiah, a Yad Vashem, a memorial, and a name. Among the pathways of stone and olive trees, a garden was planted, the garden of the righteous among the nations. Each tree bore a plaque engraved with a name: a farmer from Poland, a priest from France, a Muslim family from Albania, a Japanese diplomat who defied his own empire. Each tree stood as proof that even in the age of death camps and hatred, some refused to surrender their humanity. In the decades that followed, survivors began to return, carrying old photographs and trembling memories. They searched for the people who had once saved them, the ones who had given them new names, new lives. Many found graves instead of faces. Others found descendants who listened in disbelief as strangers arrived at their door saying, "Your grandfather saved me." Irina Sendler finally received her recognition in 1965, when Yad Vashem named her one of the righteous among the nations. By then she was elderly, living quietly, still modest. When asked if she felt like a hero, she said, "I only did what I was supposed to do. I could have done more. Chune Sugihara's family accepted his honor on his behalf." He never spoke of his defiance, even to his children, believing humility mattered more than fame. Raoul Wallenberg's tree stands tall despite his uncertain fate, a symbol of courage without closure. And in the garden's corner, a plaque for the people of Albania, who as a nation protected every Jew within their borders. Over 27,000 names now fill the Garden of the Righteous, men and women from more than 50 countries, of every faith and background. But for every name remembered, there are countless others lost to history, their acts unrecorded, their compassion unmeasured. The garden is silent except for the wind moving through the leaves, a whisper that carries across time. One person can make a difference. And in that quiet rustle, the world is reminded of a truth that still matters, that goodness, even when buried beneath fear and ash, can take root again. Chapter 8. Rediscovering Humanity. Decades passed, and the rescuers' stories began to fade, buried under the noise of modern life, forgotten by a world eager to move on. But history has a way of whispering until someone listens. And in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, those whispers grew louder. Grandchildren found boxes in attics filled with yellowed letters and old photographs. Universities launched research projects to track the unknown heroes. Museums opened exhibitions showing small objects of resistance, a forged baptism certificate, a child's shoe, a rosary that once hid a Jewish star. Across Europe, survivors and their descendants began searching for the people who had once saved them. A woman from Paris found the granddaughter of the Algerian imam who had hidden her in a mosque. An old man from Poland traveled to Albania to plant flowers on the grave of the family who had called him son. In Morocco, Jewish and Muslim elders met again after 60 years apart, their reunion filmed, their laughter breaking decades of silence. In classrooms, new generations began to learn that the Holocaust was not only a story of death, but also of courage. That amid unspeakable evil, some people still chose good, not because they were stronger, but because they refused to be afraid. Teachers spoke of ordinary people who had done extraordinary things, and children listened, wide-eyed, unbelieving that the world could once have been so cruel or so brave. In Israel, Yad Vashem continued to add names to its growing list. But beyond the plaques and trees, something deeper was happening. The descendants of rescuers and survivors began to see each other not as victims or saviors, but as part of the same human story. In the Netherlands, one rescued child's grandson married the granddaughter of the family who hid him. In France, a school was named after Si Kador Ben Abrit, the imam who turned his mosque into a sanctuary. And in Turkey, a memorial was built to honor Selahattin Ülkümen, not for his religion, not for his nation, but for his courage. The rescues had ended long ago, but the humanity behind them was rediscovered, not in grand gestures, but in quiet reconciliation, in shared remembrance, in simple acts of listening. Because remembering is its own kind of resistance. Every time their names are spoken, every time their stories are told, the darkness that once ruled the world loses a little more of its power. And through that memory, the rescuers live on, not as saints, but as reminders that compassion is timeless, and that even the smallest act of courage can echo across generations. Epilogue: Light that never died. The world has changed 1,000 times since the war ended. Borders have shifted, empires have fallen, new conflicts have begun. But the stories of the rescuers, the quiet heroes who risked everything for strangers, remain as bright as they were in those dark years. Many of them never lived to see their names honored. Their graves are simple, their faces forgotten. But the lives they saved became entire generations. Great-grandchildren, all carrying the invisible inheritance of compassion. In Israel, in Poland, in France, in Morocco, in Albania, the survivors' descendants still light candles each year, not just for the millions who were lost, but for the few who refused to be bystanders. They light them in silence, not with sorrow, but with gratitude, because history, for all its cruelty, still allows us to choose. And in the 1940s, when the world seemed beyond redemption, some chose mercy over fear, action over apathy, and light over darkness. They had no armies, no weapons, no hope of victory, but they acted quietly, stubbornly, humanly. And in doing so, they proved something eternal, that the capacity for good does not vanish even when evil seems unstoppable. Every act of rescue, every loaf of bread hidden under a coat, every forged document, every whispered prayer was a defiance of despair. And those small sparks, scattered across a dying world, became the reason the world survived. Today, their names grow on the trees of Yad Vashem, engraved in stone, remembered in film, whispered in classrooms. And every time one of those stories is told, every time someone asks, "What would I have done?" their light burns a little brighter. The rescuers didn't save the world, but they saved what makes it worth saving. Because in an age when compassion was punishable by death, they chose to be human. And that light has never died. Thank you for watching. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Maybe you have a story to share about these heroes, or someone else from the war years. Stay healthy, subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and see you in the next one. And if you have an idea for another untold story, share it in the comments. Your voice helps keep their memory alive.